My job is got easier because we want to finish by 5, so I'm not going to do a lot of talking and a lot of introduction. I'm just going to let the panel do what they need to do. But just quickly, obviously our topic today is geopolitics and hybrid warfare and how do we prepare for the new normal in cybersecurity. And I saw a great quote the other day that said, what if this isn't the storm and it's the climate? And we are just living in a world that is changed in the last 10 years, from really stable, focus on globalization, and now it's grounded in geopolitical risk. So we've seen significant shifts in the way the US approach cybersecurity. There's increased emphasis on national security and defenses against state-sponsored cyber threats. So a lot of these changes have been driven by a series of high-profile cyber incidents, including election interference, ransomware attacks, and espionage campaigns. So as the nations vie for sort of technological dominance and strategic advantage, the risks associated with cyber warfare have escalated, and there's significant challenges both for government and private sector. So from an Irish perspective, these developments are particularly relevant because we have all the multinational big tech companies here, but how do we protect our national interests as well? So we have a panel, it's absolutely fantastic. I think there's over 100 years experience sitting here, and they are going to answer the questions. My first guest is, I'm just sitting in the wrong order. We've got Brendan McLean from the National Cyber Security Centre, and Brendan, obviously, the National Cyber Security Centre is obviously at the forefront of protecting government networks and safeguarding our critical national infrastructure. But obviously they have to work with Europe and their international partners to develop these relationships, and they also have a critical role in the new NIS2 directive. Next Brendan is Pat Ryan, who's from Ghana Shekhana, and Pat Ryan is currently responsible for overseeing the operations at the Ghana National Cyber Crime Bureau. He has over 30 years experience. He's represented on Ghana Shekhana at Europol and Interpol. He's also a member of Interpol Global Cybercrime Experts Group, and he chairs the European Union Cybercrime Task Force. And Pat has something he wants to say, and as soon as I've done the introductions, he's going to have his say. Next to Pat, we have Ian Thornton, and he's from RMI, Risk Management International, and he's all about resilience and risk management. That's his speciality. He's got 25 years experience in the Irish military and diplomatic security, corporate security, and risk management consulting. He moved from Special Forces unit into the private sector, and he specializes in emergency planning, pen testing, crisis management, and working in the construction, pharmaceutical, utilities, aviation, and the financial industry. A very experienced. And last but definitely not least, we've got Conor McCoy from HPE, and he's the head of cyber detection engineering. He leads a global function focused on advanced threat detection, 25 years experience across IT, cyber, and compliance, and he also holds a master's in computing and cybersecurity. So I think that's a very, very big panel. I really want to hand over now and just have some good conversation. So to kick off, I think that we just say, what are you seeing on the ground at the moment? What's your perspective on where we're at? And how have the Irish attitude to cybersecurity changed in the last 10 years? And Pat, because you want to start, you want to just get something off your chest, maybe you go first. We can take that one.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I suppose, look, I just want to make a point there at the start during the immersive labs exercise, which I thought was very good, it was excellent, because you can really start to understand what sort of decisions need to be made when something goes wrong. But I was very surprised that the audience, 22% said that they would contact law enforcement. And I suppose that's just a point that I'd like to raise very quickly, is that when something goes wrong, it can be very distressing, and things can move very, very quickly. And even just my own experience when it comes to cybercrime, it can happen to anyone, even the best of us, and that's just the way it is, unfortunately. Things can go wrong. But I would just like to point out that, one of the priorities for Irish economy, especially the Irish National Cybercrime Bureau, is we're there to support victims of crime. That's what it is at the end of the day. So, if you do reach out to us, I think not, we would always be treating individuals with utmost confidentiality, but it informs us about what's actually happening in that cyberspace. And just if someone does contact us, we have experts in the fields of cybercrime investigations, and at the end of the day, we're well used to dealing with these types of situations, and we're here to provide advice and support in the first instance, as I said. So that's just a point I just wanted to get across. But I think it's hugely important. Just with regards to what we're seeing at the moment, and we've all seen how technology has evolved over the last number of years, last 10 years. Cybercrime is evolving just as quick, and threat actors and these organised crime groups are very quick to leverage on new technologies, and AI is a big theme of this conference, and they will utilise that as well where they can. I suppose there's one thing that really, my own view is when it comes to AI, is very much lowering the entry level to cybercrime and threat actors. It's a very easy kind of progression for threat actors to get on that path. But even just looking at the landscape at the moment, it's a lot of the usuals, I would say. Even just when you look at the threat landscape, NISA, I'm sure Brandon will talk about that. NISA is the European Agency for Cybersecurity. They kind of look at the top threats, and their latest reports, it's still the ransomwares, malware, social engineering is the big issue, and then threats against data availability and the information manipulation. So they're still there, and they've been around for a long time. And I suppose it's really how threat actors are now starting to use technology to make attacks against our confidentiality, our integrity, and the availability of our systems more efficient for their use.
I think that's right. Send it down to Conor at the end. And if you want to give more flavour on what you actually do for a living, because that introduced very well, feel free to add that.
Well, I lead the detection engineering function for Geopolitics Enterprise, so I have responsibility for engineers that run SIEM, SOAR, data insights. The detections that our team creates are what feeds actionable events that the Cyber Defense Centre would then work. We would also provide top-tier support for all of our data ingestion systems. But in terms of what we're seeing out there, it's more of the same, not too exciting. The phishing is still right up there, malware, crypto mining, all the usual stuff is still there. What I think has changed significantly over the last 10 years is the threat landscape. As things have become so much more hybrid connectivity right out at the edge, your data centers, colos, private cloud, public cloud, that attack surface has changed. So when we used to probably focus more on perimeter defense, we've now got to focus on the defense everywhere. Say shadow IT was always a problem, it's still a problem, but we're seeing more and more problems now with what I would call shadow AI and shadow data, where you have uncontrolled lots of data and intellectual property through, let's call it the rogue use of shadow use of AI. And it's going to be very, very difficult to protect your data if you can't nail down where that's residing or how it's classified. I would say in general that I think user awareness is at an all-time high. I think users are much, much more aware of the threat now than they were. That's an overall view.
It's interesting, so the common law cyber criminal is still number one.
Our ground cyber criminal is still out there trying to make money as quick as they can and as easily as they can.
Good afternoon, guys. I suppose I have a different kind of perspective than the guys because
working through some of the private sector stuff we see now at the moment and dealing with critical national infrastructure, we're seeing that we have state actors involved also. So the difference between, say, a criminal entity where they search for money and a state actor, the state actor may look for money, but he also may look for impact. So impact is seen then through, in the case of our geopolitical situation in Europe, you would say Europe's in a low level hybrid warfare. So how that is manifested on the ground is what our RYCs day to day would be infiltration of protest action groups, cause disruption, whether that be in relation to elections or not. It can be targeting of national infrastructure to build capacity for the future. So in terms of, you're looking at capacity building now, capability building now, in lieu of maybe further military action down the line. So we are seeing that in Ireland at the moment. And if you look even how we can use it, what you see, an open source information that you use, you see they're conducting operations off our coast. So if you think they're conducting operations off our coast, they're conducting operations. And with a hybrid warfare system, you're looking at, different points of attack. And one of them being is what state actors will look for is ambiguity. So ambiguity will come in the form of, if you can get someone else to do your attack, like a protest action group or something like that, those infiltrations come through social media, they come through infiltration of those protest action groups, etc. And you will see a lot more of that, I think, in the next few years. And Ireland perceives itself as a neutral state, which it is. But in terms of how we're viewed in Europe, we're interconnected by our companies to the US and the rest of Europe. So it's kind of naive for us to think that we're not targeted in the same way as everyone else. And because we're a non-NATO member, it leaves us slightly more vulnerable in that scenario. For the geopolitical situation in Europe, then it'll be interesting. We heard one of our speakers say about the funding mechanism for the UK. So will the next 2 years see NATO move from a defensive posture to an offensive posture in terms of cybersecurity?
Brendan has your time to jump in. You have 1 foot in Ireland and 1 foot in Europe, I would say.
Yeah, certainly. It's a team sport and it's an international effort. I just, want to take a quick, just to plug the NCSC for them and say that the reason I'm here and our mission is to be Ireland's response to cyber risk. And the NCSC goes that way, detecting and also responding to cyber threats, building national resilience, and then, of course, reporting, providing upon and impartial advice to within that, I sit in the strategic threat analysis team, and in that we examine and analyse systemic cyber risks. Two of our tasks currently we're drafting a national cyber risk assessment, which looks at that systemic risk, and secondary we provide reporting on that strategic basis. And since this is a strategic discussion, I do want to back up what the other members have said here. The main threat to Irish network and information systems, the majority of it is financially motivated cyber crime. But we should also recognise the threats that exist from nation-state NPT groups and state nexus actors, which is disruptive attacks, disruptive DDoS, hackism, espionage, cyber espionage, and influence operations. We're being told at the moment that it feels like we're living in an era of increased strategic competition, great power competition, and it's like that states during that time want to project the terrorists, and they project that because if you look strong, hopefully you don't have to actually use that strength. And I think there is something in that when it comes to cyber capability, because to an extent, once it's used, it's spent, it's out there. And the efficacy of it, to use a second time, is diluted. And there's a bit of fire and forget in terms of cyber capability at state level. So I think potentially that's to the forefront of state actors' minds. That's not to say I think that the norms, to the extent that they exist, are being pushed a bit or are changing. An example of that is the pager attack that happened in Lebanon. But nevertheless, having said that, I think it's important to note that this will be my final point, from 2022, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, through 2023, war in the Middle East, we haven't seen state-on-state, tier 1 state actors conduct destructive attacks on one another. And there is we believe, or the general consensus that capability exists, but we haven't seen it happening. Why haven't we seen it happening? I don't know. Potentially states that there might be a cautious recognition among state actors of a sense of mutual destruction and a sense that there's a reluctance to release that kind of capability. So while there is a bit of creep in terms of rules, to the extent that they exist, I think it's important to know as well that we haven't seen major state-on-state destructive attacks so far. So I'd say an Irish-based opinion, but a global.
So I think you kind of touched on question 2, so we're all going to be, it's flowing well. But to say, then we have to understand that cyber is now no longer just contained to the digital realm, and it very much has a physical side that we need to look at. And we know with the Heathrow shutdown, and whether that was or wasn't a cyber attack from the fire, it disrupted everything from global supply chains, and also we have to look at the public trust, because when the Spanish power outage, instantly everybody said it was a cyber attack. Now whether it was or it wasn't is almost irrelevant at this point, because this is the state that we've got to. And we actually have to now start planning for disruption to the critical infrastructure. I know personally, I went to the cash point and drew some cash out because I never carry cash. And you realise you need to actually have cash. We saw that with the storm. So yes, whether it's cyber or not cyber, I think people are now realising it's not just contained down to your computer or your operations in business. So I don't know if you want to maybe sort of expand on that. Start with you at the end of the table there.
I think strategic advantage, like history has shown us that's been really tied to technological advantage. I'll speak from my own perspective of it, like Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Whilst we may not be a specific target geopolitically, we have a lot of very potent technology that would be an incredibly attractive target to any amount of threat actors. I think about 5 of the world's top 10 fastest supercomputers we design and manufacture those through the HPE Cray platform. We have a bank, maybe you might not realise that, but we have an international bank headquartered out of Leeds in Dublin. Our latest generation of liquid cooled supercomputers are pretty much running a lot of the world's AI workloads at the moment. And our servers run the space station. So we're an attractive target, we recognize that, so more so because of the intellectual property. So that's where our focus is really on trying to keep that intellectual property and protect that data keep all that locked down.
Thanks, Carl. So like one of our key areas in RMI is critical national infrastructure. So we deal with aviation, we deal with energy, etc. In terms of where we're going inside culture, as you said, we're talking about critical national infrastructure here. So up to 2026 4x expenditure on energy that we didn't have before, whether that's down to data center needs or whatever it is, or infrastructure increase up to 24 billion the next year. In line with that, then that gives, say, with that increase, that being so quick and being so fast, we were bound to have vulnerability in that space. And I think that's something for Ireland to be aware of, and that moving that fast also brings concerns around how we're going to so I'm sure Brendan can offer insights and how we're going to do that. As I said already, in terms of state actors, or even criminal, there's a time and a place that you can, when it's the best time to do your tax. So you may see, as we did with HSB, it's been spoken to death about it, but they had smaller indications that time was coming, and it's important we don't ignore that. And also, I would say that over the next probably 5 to 10 years, you will see Ireland as very.
And I think you can quite a lot to say about the agency and how that's changed and what we've learned since then.
Yeah, I think, look, it's a real awakening, I suppose, for Ireland, England, I would say, which really has made the whole country much more aware of the impacts that can have, cyber that can have. And I know we talked about that just at the end, just around some key recommendations and lessons learned, not just with HSC, but there's plenty of motivation for cyber criminals, in my view, for various reasons for cyber attacks. And as we said, we're seeing is the majority are financially motivated, but there is, and threat actors are very well organised. They have their own business models now, and they're opportunists as well. So their teams are constantly scanning, they're constantly looking for openings and vulnerabilities that they can exploit, and they will. And that's what they do. So, so there's various different reasons. I suppose the rise in misinformation, disinformation, there's loads of different reasons why various things happen. And I suppose it's really around the key motivation, but as Brendan says, and I think from our perspective, what we're seeing is mainly is financial motivated. That's what it is.
Yeah, for sure. Go back to any moment, I think I've read there is an element of kind of totality to these threats, and you're describing cyber warfare or political warfare, active measures, but cyber and cyber attacks is only one part of that. It's one part of the full suite of, I've heard hybrid warfare being described as there are measures that are taken across economic coercion, disinformation, influence operations, military assembly or threats, total threats to achieve essentially political subversion, whatever target country that is, and critical national infrastructure, unfortunately, as Ian has spoken about, is a vulnerable and a high priority target for that. And thankfully, we're mainly experiencing cybercrime and cybercriminals. There are indicators of seeing these things in the news around hybrid warfare, and we're missing not to address these issues. But they're difficult issues to address because there's inherent obfuscation, anonymity, especially in cybercrime. You don't know who the attacker is. That leads into another conversation of attribution, which leads to this question. But these things are difficult and they require cross-government coordination, and they require a whole society approach to challenge them and to detect them early so that they don't impact citizens. And that's the challenge. One example that's happened recently in Ireland is the National Counterfeits Information Strategy, which is published. That is a cross-government whole of society effort to tackle one element of what we describe there as home warfare. There are lots of elements, and we rely on our globalisation and our interconnectivity with the EU provides a vulnerability in that sense, in that our energy infrastructure is subsea, our connectivity is subsea, and therefore it's vulnerable to sabotage. Maybe not vulnerable, but there's potential sabotage there. And like I said, cybersecurity, these things have an attribute, and cyber is only one element of this, but there are physical elements too, hence the multi-agency approach to tackling this issue.
So we can't have an event without mentioning AI, and we have to make sure that we get back to the main stage next year. We're going to bring AI in here. So I want, we hear all about AI and cybersecurity. I want to know, are you hearing anything concrete on the ground? Is AI having an effect on cyber attack? And what are the defenders doing in return? Are they actually, can it? I know Marcus Hutchins, the cybersecurity expert, this is the last one, unraveled the last one. And he said, we use the same tools as criminals. The only difference is the intent. And then the thing is, he obviously is a malware fighter. So he has to build malware to understand it. And so what's the difference between him building malware and a cyber criminal building malware? Just the intent. And it's very easy to cross from one side to the other. So what do we see with AI and how is that helping? And then on top of that, you've got organizations running with the new regulations. So we've got the Institute Directive, we've got DORA, we've got the AI Act. What are you seeing that, concrete evidence? And that's not just hype. I think the lovely thing about this panel is nobody's trying to sell anything. You're not talking about a particular product here, it's just what's happening on the ground and what you need to know. Thank you, go first.
Well, I suppose, look, again, go back to the role of the Garda National Cyber Bureau. We're there to investigate crime, and I suppose we're starting to see what impacts on AI can have with regards to crime, and specifically, I suppose, in relation to phishing and things like that, and how things become much more realistic. My bureau is also responsible for the digital forensics of all the devices that are EPCs during investigations. Unfortunately, a large proportion of our work is about transaction abuse type materials, how AI is now starting to be used to generate this type of material. So there's plenty of challenges there. But when the last answer, maybe specifically around the cybersecurity side of things. So,
I go next then. So look, the main thing I would say is, you spoke about, Andrea, how the two sides have the same set of tools, but there's two sides do not have the same set of rules. So,
Once it has
one has no rules, exactly. That's the kind of point I was going to make, that if you were a criminal searching for to make money or to attack, you have no rules, whereas there is very distinct protocols, I'm sure, in terms of how you do law enforcement and your defense using AI in cyberspace arena. We spoke about NIST as well. So big part of our model has been given cyber consultation, but given that we have three people that are absolute experts in that space, I think it needs 210% on the physical aspects and how we target our areas. So if you take that you would spend a small fortune on an AI system to protect your cyber security, you might spend minimum wage on a guy to protect it on site. So given that's where my focus would lie. And I think that's a big part going forward for private companies, especially the likes of Hewlett Packard, those that have protected themselves from corporate espionage, where you would say, okay, we also have to look at that to a certain detail also. Whereas if that's operating in the AI system, physically the AI system on site, not just the site. And I know it's a different perspective, but it is important.
I think that's a great point.
I think it's a very interesting point. I think what you said as well about the speed to deploy is a very accurate comment. You know, the threat actor doesn't have to go through an AI compliance board or complete yards of corporate regulation or even proceed with something. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's just slow. Look, in terms of on the ground and AI, I'm going to touch wood and say we're not seeing any, let's say, novel attack vectors at the moment as we turn something like. We are seeing much more advanced phishing campaigns, much more advanced malware, much more realistic deployments of same. Particularly in those sort of pay and spray campaigns. Daniel touched on some of those in his presentation earlier on code contained in such campaigns where we know it's AI generated. So, in terms of the response, we're seeing more and more use of AI as let's call it an augmenter in the analyst response. AI is useful in dramatically reducing the amount of time and research that an analyst has to do in actually working on alert. You also use them in generating scripts to retrieve data from certain logs or whatever the case may be, and also useful again then in fueling some of your SOAR responses. So we're seeing that certainly as something we're actively working on. Let's put it that way. I'd say that big model-based detections are still very, very hard, certainly for an environment like ours where on any given day probably 100,000 people. But it can be very useful in user behavioral analytics, anomaly detection, that kind of thing. It's just as that set gets larger, it's harder to eliminate false positives. And unfortunately, that's like, let's say you find one positive amongst 50, you've still got to go and investigate the other 49. And that's still a problem in terms of time and resources. So, yeah, the AI certainly going to change things. Probably not as fast as we thought it would. A bit more work to do there, but it's definitely on the way.
Brendan, what are the conversations you're having with counterparts in Europe at the moment?
Sure. I remember actually there's been an international push around AI lately, especially since the onset of the Trump presidency and the criticism that sometimes the EU feels over stifling innovation, and this is a very important inflection point in terms of innovation. From the previous introduction, I'm from the strategic threat analysis team, and systemic threats. And sometimes the rapid adoption of innovation can conflict exactly with that. At the threat level, at the attack level, there are certainly, I think we've seen before, in the presentation before, artifacts in malware which have detected the presence of LLMs. Certainly, phishing campaigns have become more sophisticated, and of course, the language element has opened up new markets and threat actors who have language proficiency. So there are other parts of the world where the entire AI phishing campaigns that potentially might not have been before. So that's at the attack level. At the system level as well, from a systemic, there are risks and risks to adoption. There are risks around the confidentiality of such vast data sets, stealing of the same. There are issues around data poisoning of training sets, and there are issues around potential model extraction. So these risks exist, and I'm not saying we should stifle innovation. They need to be considered considered in parallel. And of course then there are risks at the organisation and the individual level in terms of proficiency, training, familiarity with AI, and the rapid adoption of AI, particularly in organisations that take that risk, particularly in government. The rapid adoption of AI may potentially have bring an unacceptable risk because of the potential downstream impact on citizens and public services. So there are, but I would like to go now and try to. I don't think AI is today, as we sit here, creating novel attack vectors in cybersecurity. It's lowering the barrier of entry for traditional ones. It's making it more sophisticated, but we haven't seen any novel attack vectors based on it.
Thank you, and I think that's the joy of having this panel here, is what's happening on the ground. So to sum up, we're living in a time of unpredictability. We don't know what's going to happen in the US from day to day. We've had all the spate of retail ransomware attacks in the UK. What do the next couple of years look like? And in Ireland, what can we do? And I think always, we love our jobs. We live cybersecurity, we think it's really interesting and cool, but not many people do. So if you're going back to your organisation, what do they need to know? What can they do? What should we be telling them? And I think maybe, your parting thoughts. And I'm going to let you go first this time.
Great. So at the Irish level, I think there is our law enforcement are having success against cyber criminals. One takeaway that we haven't seen any novel attack vectors from AI. Is to the NCSC is being put on a statutory footing, and in-scope entities are preparing themselves with this too. We're hardening ourselves to the posture of the country. Globally, I think there is, it's less clear. There is talk of sovereignty, there is elements of fragmentation which conflicts with our cybersecurity principles. Cybersecurity is extraterritorial and it's a team sport, it's an international playing field, and fragmentation and sovereignty can potentially cause obstacles to rapid cybersecurity response. But I think there's good takeaways at a national level for Irish cybersecurity question.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with I think a lot has been done in the last couple of years. Personally, I feel like we've got a lot of regulation coming, probably, but it needs to be done. That's the thing. And that's really about making us more resilient. And I suppose cooperation has never been so strong. I think myself, friends, humans, with the NCSC and the National Cyber Bureau work very closely together. And indeed, the NCSC has its European outreach and global outreach, and indeed so does the National Cyber Bureau. We have that piece-to-piece cooperation. Globally, we work very closely with our colleagues in Europe and in Europe. So I suppose we've never been so well connected with regards to that global reach to assist with our investigations anyway, and the NCSC where we can help. Because not one of these, most of the threats have a criminality element to them or an incident. So when they do happen, so that's where we would come in. But just, I suppose, from my own perspective, a large majority of the incidents that are reported aren't probably very sophisticated. Really, it's down to poor cyber hygiene, and that's where I would always say that education and training and awareness, I suppose, of the staff is really, really important. I saw a very interesting study there the other day that was saying that only 3% of security budgets are aimed at the human layer, whereas 68% of cyber incidents can be traced back
that should be readily, information should be readily available at this stage. And to conduct exercises then to ensure that it's still relevant. And I would always say, if you were in trouble, don't be afraid to reach out to your national service bureaus in the last door. We are there to assist and advise in the first place.
Expect you stole all my points. No, I back up both Brendan and Pat's points on the planning and the crisis management exercise. If you look at it from a point, in many cases, what we see is we strategically, like you both look at it very strategic, and a lot of people who come to us in our mind look for to do everything up front. So a lot of people are responding to what happened in the HSE, and we got an influx of people that were looking at crisis management. So when we crisis manage, we realise that a lot of the bottom were coming from the lower tier staff. And the reason being around fighting, like Pat said, but understanding how to do that. So I give you an example. If you take an employee who visits China and he may be a mid-management or a CEO, now gets a voice from an IT specialist, and you think, well, I'm uncontactable for a week. So, what we're finding is the middle ground there, that there has to be some kind of compromise of protocols put in place in the company where you understand hygiene and you understand business. Because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, like we were talking about on the ground experience. No CEO will be uncontacted for 5 days. So if you're going to do that, then have good sanitization in place, and that kind of ties into NCSE and the police getting good advice, coming to private entities like us to get up. We have, if every company went to the NCSE, they swap. So there has to be good private partners out there that like labs that will test your equipment coming home or give you something that's a sanitized version so you can travel with it and still work. And I mean, this is kind of the business model going forward in the current cyberspace. So when you're looking for advice, I would say there's a way of doing business and there's a way of staying cyber-safe also. And outside of that, the institute will be operational this October, and you must look at it from all points. Where are you going to get your? It might be as easy for somebody to have an insider threat as it is to approach it from to attack the system. So when I look at stuff, I look at the bottom groups of food credit, and look at strategically, but also look where we're going to most likely get the attack again at the base level, and then they'll work with it. So, when you actually want to plan something, you should plan so it's a function model, not a strategic model. Yeah.
I think everything said there, that just was going to add that point, know your attack surface. Sun Tzu, Art of War. If you defend everywhere, you're weak everywhere. Put your resources where they're going to matter. I don't think what the future holds, but for sure we're in uncertain times, I think. But I think personally it all just boils down for any business to come back to the fundamentals, do them well. Yeah, know your attack surface, drill this stuff, do the tabletop exercises, do your lessons learned, revise after the fact. And in terms of regulation and all of that, I would strongly advise any company that hasn't already aligned to something like ISO 27001 to go and do so. That will help you with the frameworks in place, help you, align to certain standards and do those fundamentals well, so that as a result of that, you will align with the majority of any of the legislation that comes out and be prepared for it. So yeah, and I really echo what Pat was saying there. User awareness training, a little bit goes a long way. Invest in your people, biggest asset.
So, I'm just going to shout. We've got a bit of time left. You can choose. You can either all go over to the college bar and ask some questions there, or you can stay here and we can ask a couple more questions, or both. We've got some microphones, but I think can you all hear me? Yeah. So just shout a question out if anybody has a question for one of our panelists.
What can the police do, given that these are genuinely international things, that no one just targets Ireland, they target everywhere, right? What can the police actually do if you're dealing with someone from Russia, North Korea, or wherever you're being attacked from?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt there's challenges there, and indeed when it comes to our investigation, investigations. There's challenges even with access to data. And I know that's something that the EU Commission is strongly looking at and making a recommendation around, what data law enforcement should have access to in order to carry out their investigations. And some of these investigations can take time and we have to go through mutual aid assistance to access the data in the first place. So that area is being looked at. But when you ask about, what can law enforcement do, well, attribution is what we're about. At the end of the day, we want to find out who is behind it. Yes, they may be outreach in certain instances, but that doesn't necessarily say we can't have certain actions in place. Like at the end of the day, or there's the Schengen information system, where we put alerts on it, these individuals can have travel as well. So it's really about looking what the options are. But in the first instance, you have to identify who's behind it. Once you identify it, then there is their course of action. But they can be challenged.
Anybody else? Stop.
Yeah, just maybe a question for Ian, just to touch on it in your presentation. Because as organisations get a bit more resilient to standard malware attacks, all familiar with them, we're working on them every day. What are organisations doing on the physical access front and the corporate travel area? We touched on it twice there, but to me, they're very vulnerable surfaces, and there's less focus on that, particularly then if you take a scenario where you have a physical access vulnerability, and that all of a sudden then turns into an insider threat. That makes sense. What's happening on the ground there, or is that a hard question? Apologies.
Probably on the spot there. No, it's, look, like I spoke with you, Andrea, today about, we talked about pen testing and drilling each side individually. I think in a lot of cases, when we look at people gaining physical access to sites and stress testing models, that you have to be very open and honest about the outcome. And whether it's on a strategic tabletop exercise where you go to the worst case scenario, or you stress test the system, or you stress test a site. It should be done in a non-blame environment where you can say, this is our vulnerability. I'd rather go to the site, or I'd rather stress test the system where it's we actually found 10 things wrong rather than nothing wrong, because then we have something to work towards. Yeah, that is absolutely a win. In terms of travel and education is first and foremost. Like trying to educate people as to the threats that are out there without scaremongering, it can be a problem. So I don't want to scaremongering to say, okay, you're visiting a foreign country and all he thinks about is how am I going to get attacked? What I want to.
In cyber, we have a real tendency to say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't click on links, don't do things, but we never tell people what they can do. And I think you have to turn around.
Yeah, and I think that for businesses especially who want to travel safely in space is to have an acceptable level of risk, acceptable level of protocol, and then where you have the sanitization can be done, but you always must make it easy for the person that's traveling. So if, say for example, if it is a CEO or somebody, once he comes back in Monday morning, you say, okay, you can work on your desktop, now we're going to remove your laptop and sanitize it. If that is the case, it'll be different for each company because each company has its own set of acceptable risks. For example, if you have something valuable as a backyard, you might have more stringent protocols. But if you're a company that must do business in Eastern Europe, China, even Ukraine or Russia, well then you must do business in those areas. And so it's up to each individual country. And if I was to advise that, I'd advise each one separately. And then if I run into any problems, I'll bring that.
I think we had a question behind you, John, and then the gentleman in front, and we'll finish up.
No, I was just going to ask, as a country, and particularly in the west of Ireland, we have a huge dependency on a lot of kind of undersea infrastructure for our IT, both from a connectivity and energy perspective. But we've had we've had a long history of underinvestment in marine defences. Does the panel see any kind of change in attitude towards kind of investing in protecting that infrastructure in the last number of years?
So it's not an NCSE thing, but I know that Department of Defence are undertaking at the moment a maritime security strategy. And like I said, it's a multidisciplinary approach because there are regulators who regulate gas, electricity, the subsea cables, communications, and then there are also the defenders. So it's a multidisciplinary approach, like I said before, and it is to the forefront of some of the agency's minds. From a cybersecurity perspective, my opinion is that mainly the threats to that infrastructure is physical, and that there is a cyber threat, but it's no different than any other cyber threat, and it's much more in the physical space. But I know the Department of Defence have undertaken a maritime security strategy, and the critical national infrastructure that lives within that is top priorities.
I think on that note, I'm going to wrap up on time, and I just want to thank Connor, Ian, and Brendan, and we fantastic. I appreciate your time, especially coming down from Dublin, and it's been a fantastic panel. Next year, I guarantee we'll go back on the main stage, because we haven't managed to say. But thank you so much again.